At Home in North Branch by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 9. A Plan is Revealed. Len came in from town one morning to report on a disturbing conversation he'd had with Frank Gage.
Roland Brewer was in the store this morning, Frank told him. He says you and he have a business deal arranged, something to do with the church, I gather?
He has offered to provide shingles for the roof, Len replied cautiously. But I think that was agreed to with Jerome Grayson. He hasn't talked anything over with me.
He made it sound as though it involved a pretty big sum of money, Frank said. If I didn't know you better, I'd think you asked him to contribute to a new building. I probably misunderstood.
I wanted to tell him that Brewer probably wanted him to misunderstand, but I didn't, Lang continued. Brewer does too much smooth talking around town for my liking. He's been here for almost a year, and the mill has prospered, Sarah Jane said later. So why do so many of us still have doubts about him? If he is planning something underhanded, I wish he'd get on with it. Do you think it's because the Brewers don't attend church that we have these suspicions? I asked Len. I'd hate to think so. That's a pretty shallow way of thinking. I don't believe that's it, Len replied. We all recognize that there are many ethical and moral business people that don't identify their principles as Christian. As a matter of fact, I'd think even less of a man if he joined the church just to gain the confidence of Christians rather than because he truly believed in God and his salvation. Soon after this conversation, another upsetting event took place. Len arrived home one afternoon looking grim and as close to being angry as I had seen him since the winter I almost died in the snowstorm. I had a visit from Lorenzo handy, he announced. He and I are going to have a talk with Jerome tonight. I'm afraid there's trouble coming at the mill. Oh, I hope not, I said. Could it just be a rumor started by a disgruntled employee? Not Lorenzo, but one of the mill workers? It could be, Len admitted, but we can't afford to ignore it. He left right after supper and stopped at the boarding house to pick up Lorenzo. I'm sure my astonishment was apparent a short while later when I opened the door to find Roland Brewer standing on my porch.
Good evening, Mrs. Williams, he said cordially. I invited him in. I hope I'm not intruding.
He looked around the room with interest. Won't you sit down? I said. Can I get you a cup of coffee?
Thank you. Yes, that would be lovely.
I went to the stove where the coffee pot sat on the warmer. As I put a plate of cookies on the table, Mr. Brewer spoke up.
I was hoping to speak with your husband, he said.
Len had to go make a call, I told him. I'm not sure what time he'll be back. Common civility kept me from adding, and I hope you won't wait for him.
I'm sorry, he smiled. I had hoped to confer with him about the shingles for the church roof. If you'll be so kind as to tell him I called, perhaps he'd be good enough to come by the office, say around 5 tomorrow afternoon.
I'll be glad to give him the message, I replied. I'm sure he'll be there unless something on his schedule interferes. Mr. Brewer stood up and moved toward the door.
Thank you for your gracious hospitality. I'll bid you good night.
I latched the door behind him and picked up the cups, wishing I had gone with Len. It wasn't that I feared for my safety, but the man made me nervous. His speech sounded rehearsed, as though he were reading from a book, and not a very good book at that. When Len returned, he had an amazing story to tell. By means of notes, Lorenzo Handy had repeated to Jerome what he had witnessed over the past few months concerning Lawton and Roland Brewer. Several weeks ago, Len said, Lorenzo was ambling slowly down the road past the shingle mill. He saw a light in the office window, so he stopped to check on it. He was sure that he had locked the building securely when he finished cleaning. He made his way around the bushes and approached the window. He climbed a rock to see over the sill into the office, and there were 2 men in the room. The one facing the window was Roland Brewer, and the other, with his back turned, Lorenzo recognized as Cyrus Lawton. Thinking all was well since Mr. Brewer had a right to be in his own office, Lorenzo was about to depart when he realized that the men were talking about him. You know, Lorenzo is proficient at reading lips.
Lorenzo can't hear a sound, Mr. Brewer was saying. And even if he happened to see us, he wouldn't be able to figure out what we were doing. He's bright enough to clean around here, but that's about it."
Cy said something in reply. Then Mr. Brewer continued.
"He never forgets to lock up. I'll have to return after dark to open the door for you. Now, you know where—"
Mr. Brewer turned away, and Lorenzo missed the rest of that sentence. When he turned back again, he was saying,
"Depend on you to get it out. Remember, if you're caught, I don't know a thing about it. Of course, if you aren't, it will be worth your while. I know where you can stay until it blows over."
Then the men left, and Lorenzo ran back to the road. Len continued. He went home to reflect on what he had seen and consider what it all might mean. And that's not the end of it. It gets even more unbelievable. Today, Lorenzo went into the office and found Cy and Elizabeth in conversation.
"You know what you're supposed to do when the time comes?"
Elizabeth nodded.
"You've told me enough times," she said. "But I don't like it. I'm scared, Pa."
"Scared of what?" he said. "Anyone can go off and forget to lock a safe."
Lorenzo was approaching the desk to empty the waste baskets, and Elizabeth looked at him.
"We shouldn't be talking in here. If anyone gets wind of this, I could lose my job."
"He can't hear nothing," Cy said.
Lorenzo decided that it might be a good time to wash the outsides of the windows so he could watch what was being said without suspicion. Cy went on.
"He'll decide which payroll we'll snatch, and I'll let you know."
"What happens to the men's wages?"
Elizabeth asked.
"How will any of us get paid?"
"That's Mr. Grayson's worry, I reckon," Cy answered.
"Lorenzo will be blamed for leaving the door unlocked,"
Elizabeth stated.
"Maybe, maybe not."
Cy grinned happily.
"I just might have another idea. Can't you tell what it is? But don't you worry none about that, and don't be blabbing your mouth either, hear?"
Lorenzo continued to polish the window after Cy Lawton had left. What his responsibility in all this might be, he wasn't sure, but he knew he was in possession of information that would need to be shared with someone. "So he came to me and we went directly to Jerome," Len concluded. Jerome wondered why Lorenzo had waited so long to come forward, but Lorenzo explained that he wasn't sure that he would be believed. He knew that many people in town thought he had limited intelligence because he couldn't hear. Then, too, he feared that he'd lose his job and be in real trouble if Mr. Brewer discovered that he'd been spied upon and reported. Len was even more puzzled when I told him about Roland's visit to our house. "I passed him on the road near Handy's," he said. "I know he saw me because he called my name and said good evening. Why didn't he give me the message himself? I don't like the idea of his coming out here when I'm not at home."
"It does seem odd," I said. "He didn't act as though he knew you weren't at home."
The fact that Brewer might want to use us as an alibi for his movements that evening didn't occur to either of us. End of chapter 9.